All right, kids, today we are going to go over our next history lesson. This is number 10 for you. This one is really interesting, and it is basically going to go over King Philip's War. So the last time we talked about the Pilgrims sort of going into Plymouth, but they were not the only people going to North America, and in fact, they were not the first people there. There were lots of other colonies that had started, some had failed, some were growing, and there were colonies put there by England. So that area was called New England. There was colonies that went there from France. That was called New France, and those tended to be sort of up north. Whoops, here, let me show you. Up in the northern areas. And then there was New Spain, because there were some Spanish colonies too, and those tended to be sort of down south. So you can, what this map is showing you is all these green areas, all these areas that are green, were areas that were settled by 1650, okay? And then the red areas are areas settled by 1700. So what you see is that those settlements are growing and they're starting to spread. They're starting to go a little more west, and that is what is going to start causing problems and lead to King Philip's War. Okay, so let's start with that sort of background, okay? This is called a New World in Conflict, or War against the Colonies. So while the kings of Europe fought and schemed to make their kingdoms larger, the English colonies in North America were growing larger all on their own. So you can see that starting to happen. More and more men and women were making the long journey across the Atlantic Ocean. New settlements spread across Massachusetts, over into the land we now call Rhode Island, and Connecticut. New settlers built more houses, cleared more fields, and chopped down more trees. They needed more space, and so they kept moving further west, that way, and further into Native American lands, until the Wampanoag tribe decided to fight back. Now, you remember the Wampanoag tribe from last time, and they really helped the Pilgrims on their first winter, which was very difficult, helped them learn how to grow crops, helped them with food, and they even had a treaty, right? So at first, the Wampanoag and the English had been friends. When the English settlers first came to Massachusetts, the Wampanoag showed them how to fish, how to trap game, and how to survive the harsh northern winters. Okay, so that's the Wampanoag tribe. But as the Massachusetts colony grew larger, so remember the Massachusetts colony was the one further north to where the Pilgrims were. The colonists no longer needed the Wampanoag. They grew their own crops and traded their own goods to European merchant ships in exchange for the salt, weapons, and seeds that they needed. Okay. And they forced the Wampanoag to give them more land for their growing town. Now, the king of the Wampanoag tribe, Metacom, saw that his kingdom was vanishing. Now, this was Metacom, and he is actually the son of someone that you have heard of before, the chief that helped the Pilgrims. And the chief that helped the Pilgrims was called this, Massasoit. That was the chief that helped the Pilgrims, and he made a treaty with the Pilgrims, and he had very good relationships with them for a long time. But Metacom, he had two sons. He had a firstborn son, and then Metacom was his second-born son. Okay, so Massasoit eventually died, and his first son, and I can't remember his name, it starts with a P, but it's okay, you don't need to know it. He became the chief only for about a year, but then he died too. A lot of the Native Americans were dying from diseases, and so he died of a disease. And then Metacom, who's this guy right here, he became the new chief. And he was also known as King Philip. They called him King Philip. And I sort of looked on the internet to see, why did they call him King Philip? And it turns out that he took the name King Philip to honor the relations between the colonists and his father. And he actually even purchased European-style clothes in Boston. And he was sort of the chief for several years. But you're going to see what's going to happen under his rule, and it is very interesting. So Metacom, he saw that his kingdom was vanishing as the colonists started to spread more. When his people went to fish in their favorite streams, the banks were crowded with colonists. When they walked in their hunting grounds, English hunters lurked behind trees waiting for deer. "I am resolved," Metacom announced to a friend, "that I will not see the day when I have no kingdom." Okay, now one cold January morning, there was a young Wampanoag man. Whoops, not that. Oh, sorry, I should have edited this. Okay, there was a young Wampanoag man, and it was this guy, and I'll tell you his name in a second. He left his tiny village and hurried down the icy dirt road toward Plymouth Bay. This guy, he had grown up in Metacom's kingdom, but in his teens, when he was a teenager, he went to a new college, a new little college that was built by the English to train Christian ministers. At this little college, which the English called Harvard, so he went to Harvard, the Wampanoag boy had been given the English name John Sassamon. So that's this guy's name, okay? John Sassamon knew Metacom well. Because John could read and write in English, Metacom had often asked him to carry messages to the English leaders. But now John Sassamon carried a warning. John walked for hours, shivering in the gray winter air. His feet grew numb with cold. Finally, the tall wooden walls of the Plymouth fortress came into view. John Sassamon hurried through the gates. "Where is the governor?" he asked. "I must speak to him right away." Now, this guy was the governor over here. This guy is the governor. And his name was Josiah Winslow. And he was the new governor of Plymouth. And this was a long time after, after the Pilgrims, okay? So this was the governor of Plymouth at the time, Josiah Winslow, and he was busy with paperwork, but John Sassamon waited, anxiously glancing back at Plymouth's strong walls. When he was finally brought into the governor's office, he spoke so quickly that Winslow could barely understand him. "King Metacom is raising an army," he blurted out. "He's asking every other tribe to join with him to fight against you. He plans to drive the English back to their home. I've come to warn you, but please, please don't send me back. He doesn't know I'm here. And if the warriors find out that I've warned you, they'll kill me." So, how did Winslow respond? He sighed. Like many English, he thought that the Wampanoag were stupid and not to be trusted. "You can hardly believe an Indian," he remarked to a friend, "even when they tell the truth." He turned to John Sassamon. "Go back home," he said. "Plymouth Plantation is safe." Sassamon pleaded to stay, but Winslow refused. When Sassamon left the fortress, his eyes were filled with tears. A week later, John Sassamon disappeared. His body was found, frozen into the ice of a pond. His neck was broken. So that is interesting, isn't it? He predicted it. He was murdered for what he told the governor. Okay, Josiah Winslow, the governor, and the Plymouth plantation leaders took alarm. So, of course, now they're paying attention. Perhaps Sasamon's fears had been real. When 2 men came forward claiming that they had seen 3 Wampanoag warriors kill Sasamon and throw him into the pond, the English decided to show Metacom, who was really in charge of Massachusetts. English soldiers arrested the warriors. So they arrested the Native American warriors that they think killed Sasamon. And then they brought them to Plymouth. The Wampanoag warriors were tried. That means they had a trial. And they were convicted. They were found guilty of murder. And guess what? They executed them. Oh, can you believe that? Metacom was furious. How dare the English invade his village and drag away his warriors? 3 days after the execution, Metacom and his men attacked a little Plymouth settlement, burning houses and driving the settlers away. War had begun. The war between the English and the Wampanoag dragged on for months. The colonists had more guns, but the Native Americans were better at surprise attacks and ambushes. And Metacom convinced other Native American tribes nearby to join with him in his war against the English. Native American warriors burned English settlements, killed English colonists, and took others captive, only releasing them in exchange for money and weapons. One of these captured women, her name was Mary Rowlandson, wrote about the attack on her house. "It was the dolefullest day that ever mine eyes saw," she lamented. "From all places the Indians shot against the house, so that the bullets seemed to fly like hail. Some in our house were fighting for their lives, others wallowing in their blood, the house on fire over our heads. Then I took my children to go forth and leave the house. But as soon as we came to the door and appeared, the Indians shot so thick that the bullets rattled against the house, as if one had taken a handful of stones and threw them." Mary and her children were captured and held prisoner for weeks until her husband paid money for her release. After 8 months of war, 1,300 Englishmen from Plymouth banded together to make the strongest attack yet against Metacom's forces. Metacom and his warriors had joined together with another tribe, the Narragansett. Remember that other Native American tribe that at first they wanted the Pilgrims to protect them against them because those were kind of the bad guys? Now they're joining up with them to defeat the English. And they were camped out in the middle of a treacherous swamp. The Englishmen sloshed through the swamp and attacked Metacom's camp. The battle, which became known as the Great Swamp Fight, almost wiped out the Native American warriors. Metacom himself fled west into the colony of New York and tried to convince the Mohawk tribe to give him fresh warriors and weapons. When the Mohawks refused, Metacom tried to keep on fighting with his remaining men. But his shrinking war band could not resist forever. 8 months after the Great Swamp Fight, English soldiers surrounded Metacom's camp. Metacom escaped, but his wife and 9-year-old son were captured and sold as slaves to South America. So you see, this was a two-sided battle. And when, sometimes Englishmen were captured and then released if they got money or weapons and stuff. But when the Native Americans were captured, a lot of them ended up getting sold as slaves. Here's sort of a map of King Philip's War. And what you see is all these red spots right here. These are English settlements. So you can see that there's lots of little cities all around where they're growing. And this red star is where there was an English victory. Okay, so here. So you can see that the war went through all of this area. And here there was an Indian victory or a Native American victory, and that was called Bloody Brook right there. But this whole area, everything this color, was an area of conflict. That means all of those people were in a big war. Okay, Metacom evaded the English for 10 more days, but was surrounded in the middle of a swamp, unable to get away. A Native American warrior who had joined the English forces shot Metacom. Isn't that interesting that eventually he was shot and killed, and he was shot and killed by a Native American warrior who had joined the English forces? Okay, but then you're going to see what happens next is pretty terrible. What did the English do with Metacom after he was dead? They cut off his head, and they paraded back to Plymouth in triumph and put Metacom's head up on a pole in the middle of the settlement, where it remained for years. Can you believe that? Because the English called Metacom King Philip, so because that was his sort of name, this whole war became known as King Philip's War. 12 English towns had been burned to the ground. 1 out of every 16 men had died. Crops had been destroyed and farms leveled. In the following winters, many colonists died of starvation. But more than 3,000 Native Americans had died as well. Whole villages had been burned. Entire tribes had been killed. The few remaining members of those tribes scattered, many fleeing to the north. So this war, King Philip's War, was very important because of the effect that it had by the end of it. What happened after this war was over was that the English could continue to spread. See where this little area was where they were. They could continue to spread across North America, more to the west, more south, across land that was left empty by King Philip's War. And so when they kept wanting to grow their colonies after this war, they had little resistance by the Native Americans. So that was the important effect of this war. Okay, so I know that was a pretty gory lesson for today, but I hope you enjoyed learning some new things, okay? Have a great day, guys. Bye.